The world had shrunk to a vortex of blinding white and a cold so absolute it felt like a final judgment. Each breath was a shard of ice in Ilara's lungs, and the life flickering within her womb was the only warmth left in a universe that had cast her out. The betrayal of her village was a fresh, raw wound, sharper than the wind that tore at her tattered cloak. They had called her a witch, a monster, for the very healing hands that had once mended their bones and soothed their fevers. Now, as her body began to fail, her greatest terror was not her own death, but the silent, cold end of the child she had sworn to protect. The cold of the Whisperwood felt like it was swallowing me whole, a final, lonely embrace. I wonder if it's snowing where you are right now. Let me know in the comments your name, where you're watching from, and what time it is for you. And if you feel the chill of this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Her mind replayed the accusations, the faces of friends and neighbors twisted into masks of fear and hatred. She had been their healer, a vessel for the quiet magic of the earth, but a single, unexplainable tragedy, a child lost to a fever her poultices couldn't break, had turned their gratitude to suspicion. They spat her name, condemning her with the same fervor they had once used to praise her. Cast out, pregnant and alone, she had fled to the one place more feared than her supposed witchcraft, the Whisperwood. The forest, a place of myth and monsters, felt perversely safer than the world of men she had left behind. Here, at least, the judgment was honest. The ancient trees did not pretend to love you before they decided to kill you. The weight of her unborn child was a constant, heavy reminder of another secret, another love condemned and lost. She pressed a hand against her swollen belly, a desperate, protective gesture against the encroaching numbness. This child, this tiny, innocent life, was the only reason she had forced her frozen limbs to move this far. Every faint flutter and gentle kick was a rebellion against the despair that threatened to consume her, a silent promise of a future she was beginning to believe would never come. Her deepest fear was a quiet one, a mother's primal dread of failing her young. It was not the pain of freezing or the terror of the woods that haunted her, but the image of her child's life extinguishing before it had ever truly begun. Beneath the layers of fear and exhaustion, a stubborn, foolish ember of a wish still burned, for a home, a place of warmth and safety, where they would not be just tolerated, but truly belong. The Whisperwood itself was a living entity, ancient and hostile. The gnarled, skeletal fingers of the trees clawed at the oppressive grey sky, and the wind carried strange, melodic whispers that seemed to mock her suffering. Legends claimed that no human who entered its shaded depths ever returned, for it was the domain of the Fae, a realm of powerful, alien magic that was poison to mortals. Every snap of a twig in the oppressive silence, every shadow that danced at the edge of her vision, sent a fresh wave of terror through her exhausted body. She was a trespasser in a forbidden kingdom, and the blizzard felt like the forest's own violent immune response, a conscious effort to purge the human contamination from its sacred heart. The cold was more than a physical sensation. It was a magical apathy, a creeping lethargy that drained her will to fight. Her strength finally abandoned her. She stumbled, her legs giving way, and collapsed into a deep snowdrift that swallowed her to the waist. The world narrowed to a pinprick of fading light as the cold became a seductive, peaceful lullaby, promising an end to all pain. This was it. Closing her eyes, she offered a final, silent apology to the life within her. But just as consciousness began to fray, a sound cut through the howl of the wind, a sound that did not belong. It was not the groan of a tree or the cry of a beast. It was a footstep, a deliberate, impossibly steady tread drawing closer. Her heavy eyelids fluttered open, and through the swirling curtain of snow, a figure emerged, a silhouette of impossible height and grace, moving through the raging storm as if it were a calm summer's day, radiating an ancient power that was both terrifying and undeniably real. The warmth that seeped into her skin from his touch was a violent shock, a stark contrast to the lethal cold that had claimed her. It was more than mere heat. It felt like life itself being poured back into her veins, a potent, ancient energy that was both terrifying and intoxicating. Her mind, foggy and slow, struggled to process the figure before her. He was impossibly tall, with features carved from ancient stone and eyes that held the depth of a starlit winter sky. His presence commanded the storm to quiet, the wind itself seeming to bow to his will. When he spoke, his voice was not a request but a decree, a sound that resonated in the very marrow of her bones. "Come home," he said, and the words were a paradox, a promise of sanctuary from a complete stranger who looked more like a god or a demon than a man. She was too weak to question, too close to death to refuse, as he effortlessly lifted her from her snowy grave. Her past was a tapestry woven with the threads of service and sacrifice. From a young age, Ilara had communed with the earth, her hands able to coax remedies from roots and leaves that baffled the village elders. She had been their cherished healer, a beacon of hope against the daily hardships of life. The people of Oakhaven had been her family, their joys her own, their sorrows a weight she carried willingly. She had set broken bones, soothed fevers, and delivered their children into the world, her magic a quiet, steady presence they had come to depend on. This deep-seated love for her community was the foundation of her identity, a purpose that gave her life meaning. The memory of their smiles and words of gratitude was now a ghostly echo, a cruel reminder of the life that had been stolen from her, making their ultimate betrayal a wound that festered deep within her soul. The father of her child had been a fleeting warmth in the encroaching chill of her life, a secret she held close to her heart. He was a cartographer from the capital, a man named Liam, with ink-stained fingers and eyes that saw not a witch or a tool, but the woman beneath. He had been fascinated by her knowledge of the wild, and in his company she had felt seen for the first time. Their love had bloomed in stolen moments in the woods, a brief, beautiful season of whispered promises and shared dreams. He had sworn to return after charting the northern territories, to take her and their future child away from the small-minded village, but he never came back. Word eventually reached her of a brutal bandit attack on his caravan. His loss was a silent, private grief she had to bear alone, a hollow ache that made the village's later accusations feel like a second public execution of her heart. The turning point had been the blacksmith's daughter, a little girl with a laugh like wind chimes, who had succumbed to the red vein fever. Ilara had fought for her life for 3 days and nights, her hands raw from grinding herbs, her voice hoarse from chanting ancient words of mending. She had exhausted every ounce of her knowledge and power, but the sickness had been too aggressive, a dark tide she could not turn back. The child's death shattered the community, and their grief, desperate for a target, curdled into suspicion. Whispers began to circulate that Ilara's magic had soured, that she had perhaps made a pact with dark forces for her powers, and this was the price. Her helplessness in the face of the fever was twisted into a narrative of malevolent intent, and the healer they had once revered became the monster they needed to blame for their pain. This crushing weight of responsibility was now her only anchor. The life growing inside her was the last vestige of Liam, the final, tangible piece of a love that had been pure and untainted by the fear and superstition of her village. Protecting this child was more than a mother's instinct. It was a sacred vow, an act of defiance against a world that had taken everything from her. Every flutter and kick was a reminder of what she was fighting for, a tiny, persistent heartbeat that drowned out the echoes of condemnation. This singular focus was what had driven her into the deadly Whisperwood, what had forced her to put one frozen foot in front of the other. The thought of failing this child, of letting this last light extinguish, was a terror far greater than any monster the forest could conjure or any winter storm could unleash. Because of this, the very idea of love or romance had become a poison she could not afford to even consider. Her heart was a fortress, its walls built from the stones of betrayal and mortared with the grief of abandonment. She had learned the harshest of lessons. To trust was to invite pain, and to love was to give someone a weapon to destroy you. The faces of her neighbors, twisted with hatred, were seared into her memory, a constant reminder of how quickly affection could turn to scorn. She saw herself as a harbinger of misfortune, a cursed soul whose presence brought only suffering to those she cared for. To dream of a partner, of a shared life, felt like a selfish, dangerous fantasy. Her purpose was clear and solitary, to ensure the survival of her child. There was no room for anything else, especially not for a vulnerability as perilous as love. The journey was a blur of impossible sensations. The biting cold of the blizzard dissolved into a soft, temperate stillness, and the oppressive grey sky was replaced by a canopy of glowing, silver-leafed trees that seemed to drink the moonlight. She was cradled in arms as strong as ancient oak, moving through a world that shimmered with an ethereal light. The air itself hummed with a palpable magic, a living energy that soothed her aching body even as it terrified her rational mind. She caught fleeting glimpses of elegant, crystalline structures spiraling into the heavens, waterfalls that cascaded without a sound, and beings with eyes like liquid starlight who watched her passage with unnerving curiosity. She was a captive, a prize, or a guest. She couldn't know. Her last conscious thought was the image of her rescuer's face, a king of this impossible realm, his expression an unreadable mask of grim determination and ancient sorrow, leaving her adrift in a sea of unanswered questions. When Elara awoke, it was to a silence so profound it felt more like an absence than a lack of sound. She lay on silks that felt like cool water against her skin, in a room carved from a single, luminous piece of pearlescent stone. The air was sweet with the scent of night-blooming moon-petal and clean, cold air. Standing by a window that overlooked a city of impossible, spiraling towers was the being who had pulled her from the snow. Theron. He was not a man, but something far older, sculpted from millennia of duty and sorrow. His silver hair fell like a waterfall over broad shoulders, and his profile was sharp and noble, like a king from a forgotten legend. When he finally turned, his eyes, the color of a twilight sky just before the stars emerge, held no warmth. They held the crushing weight of a dying star, an ancient, cold authority that made the air in her lungs feel thin and borrowed. He was magnificent, terrifying, and utterly unreadable. He ruled a kingdom that was slowly, silently bleeding to death. Ilanthia was no longer the vibrant, eternal realm of song and starlight it had been in ages past. A creeping blight, which the elves called the Withering, was leaching the magic from the very soil. The silver leaves of the ancient trees were tarnished with a creeping grey. The enchanted streams ran sluggish and quiet, and for the first time in 10,000 years, the elves were beginning to feel the touch of time. They grew weary, their light dimming, their immortality fraying at the edges. Theron felt this decay as a physical pain, a constant, dull ache in his soul. Every muted laugh, every faded tapestry, every star that seemed less bright in the sky was a testament to his failure. He walked the silent halls of his palace, a king presiding over a beautiful, perfect corpse, the quiet desperation a poison in his veins. This silent decay fueled a growing unrest within his own court. The Elven Council, comprised of nobles who had lived since the dawn of the world, were proud and deeply traditionalist. They saw Theron's desperate search for a solution as a sign of weakness, a departure from the ancient ways that had sustained them for eons. Lord Valerius, his most outspoken rival, argued that introducing an outsider, a mortal stain, into their sacred realm was a greater threat than the withering itself. The prophecy Theron clung to was, in their eyes, a madman's last gamble. He faced their thinly veiled scorn in every meeting, their resistance a wall of elegant, unyielding ice. He was a king bound by the will of his council, forced to navigate a treacherous political landscape where every move was scrutinized and every new idea was met with the suffocating weight of ancient prejudice. Beneath the veneer of cold command and regal authority was a being hollowed out by loneliness. Theron had outlived friends, loves, and every dream he had once held for his people. Immortality had become not a gift, but an eternal sentence to watch everything he cherished slowly turn to dust. His throne was an island, his crown a barrier that separated him from any true connection. He carried the fate of his entire race upon his shoulders, a burden he could share with no one. In the dead of night, he would stand on his balcony looking out at the fading lights of his city and feel the terror of his impending failure. He was not afraid of his own end, but of being the last king of Elanthia, the one who would oversee its final, silent twilight. This hidden vulnerability was a chasm within him, a secret fragility that he guarded more fiercely than any treasure in his kingdom. His desperate hope, the one he dared not fully speak aloud even to himself, rested on her. For centuries, his scholars had studied the fragmented texts of the prophecy. It spoke of a child born of human heartwood, a mortal resilience forged in suffering, and ancient magic, a child who could reignite the fading heart of Elanthia. Theron had used his power to scry the mortal realms for generations. Searching for the confluence of signs the prophecy demanded, he saw Ilara, a healer whose hands touched the deep magic of the earth, cast out and betrayed, yet fiercely protecting the new life within her. He saw the strength in her despair, the purity of her maternal love. He did not see a woman. He saw a vessel, a key, the living embodiment of his last, desperate chance. Rescuing her from the snow was not an act of mercy. It was an act of grim, calculated acquisition for the survival of his people. Ilara had spent 2 days in a state of suspended reality. Silent, graceful elves tended to her needs, bringing her nourishing broths, applying soothing balms to her frostbitten skin, and changing her rough-spun clothes for gowns of impossible softness. They moved with an unnerving lack of emotion, their beautiful faces like porcelain masks. It was a gilded cage, a place of warmth and safety that felt more threatening than the blizzard. Her fear was a constant, cold knot in her stomach, her mind racing with questions that had no answers. Who were these people? What did they want with her and her baby? Just as she finally gathered the strength to sit up on her own, the heavy carved door to her chamber opened. A tall guard in polished silver armor stood framed in the doorway, his expression severe. "The king requires your presence," he stated, his voice devoid of warmth. Immediately, a primal fear seized her. A summons from a king, in her experience, meant only judgment, and she was certain she was being led not to an audience, but to her execution. The great hall was a cavern of polished obsidian and starlight, designed to make mortals feel like insects. Ilara walked between 2 stoic guards, her bare feet silent on the impossibly smooth floor that reflected the glowing crystals on the ceiling like a captured sky. At the far end of the hall, upon a throne carved from a single, living weirwood tree, sat Theron. He was no longer the mysterious rescuer from the storm. He was a monarch in his element, radiating an aura of ancient power and crushing authority that seemed to bend the very light around him. Seated in an arc below him were a dozen other elves, their faces beautiful, impassive, and openly hostile. Their collective gaze was a physical weight, pressing down on her. judging her torn clothes, her human frailty, and the visible swell of her belly. This was not a conversation, it was a tribunal, and she was the exhibit. Theron's eyes met hers, and they were as cold and distant as the stars reflected in the floor. There was no trace of the being who had held her, no hint of shared intimacy in the face of the storm. His voice, when he spoke, was not for her ears alone, but for the hall, a clear, ringing edict that tolerated no interruption. "You stand in the heart of Elanthia, mortal," he began, the words echoing in the profound silence. "A place forbidden to your kind for 1,000 years. You were dying in my lands, a trespasser. By our most ancient laws, your life was forfeit." He let the threat hang in the air, a deliberate display of his power before his council. Elara felt a surge of defiance cut through her fear. She was not some stray animal he had found. She was a woman, a mother, and she would not be cowed into submission by his regal intimidation. She straightened her back, meeting his gaze without flinching. "But our laws were written for a time of prosperity," Theron continued, his gaze sweeping over his council before landing back on her with unnerving intensity. "That time is past. My kingdom is dying." He spoke of the withering, and his voice lost some of its harsh, regal edge, replaced by a deep, resonant sorrow that felt more genuine than anything he had shown her so far. He described the silver leaves of the forest turning to grey dust, the silent streams where music once flowed, the slow, inexorable fading of his people's light. He painted a portrait of a perfect, timeless world crumbling from within, a slow-motion apocalypse that magic could not halt. He was not just a king, he was a warden of a failing paradise, and the desperation behind his cold facade was suddenly, terrifyingly palpable. He needed something from her, and that knowledge gave her a sliver of power. For centuries, we have searched for a solution, a counter to the decay, he said, his voice dropping, drawing her into the heart of his secret. The answer lies in a prophecy, one that speaks of a union. It foretells a child born of human heartwood, the resilience forged in the suffering of your kind and ancient magic, a child who can reignite the fading heart of Elanthia. His gaze fell pointedly to her swollen stomach, and for the first time, a fissure of raw, naked hope cracked through his iron control. The air left Elara's lungs, the whispers of the villagers calling her a monster, a curse echoed in her mind, twisted into this new, horrifying context. They had cast her out for her magic, and now this ancient king wanted to claim her child as a magical cure, a living sacrifice to save his dying world. The gilded cage had just revealed its bars. He rose from his throne, a towering, magnificent figure, and descended the few steps toward her. The council watched, their disapproval a silent, suffocating wave. "I am proposing an alliance, Elara of Oakhaven," he declared, his voice once again a formal proclamation. "A binding contract. You will become my wife, and you will be queen of Elanthia. Your child will be born into royalty, the acknowledged heir to my throne." The words were so outlandish, so impossible, that she almost laughed. A queen, her, the outcast, the village witch. It was a madman's fantasy. But the look in his eyes was not madness, it was the grim calculus of a leader with no other options. He was offering her the world, a title, a crown, all in exchange for the destiny of the life growing inside her. The price was not her life, but something infinitely more precious. "You will never know cold or hunger again," Theron promised, his voice a low, seductive murmur that contrasted sharply with the public nature of the declaration. "You will be given a home, a true sanctuary, surrounded by beauty and protected by a power the mortal world cannot comprehend. Your child will have a future that you could never provide, a legacy that will be sung of for 10,000 years. They will be revered, a savior to my people, a prince or princess of an eternal realm." He was offering her the answer to the secret, desperate wish she had harbored in the snow, a home, a place to belong. But he was twisting its meaning, turning it into a transaction. Every word of comfort was a link in a chain, every promise of safety a wall in a prison for her child's soul. She saw the trap for what it was, beautiful and deadly. Ilara's mind raced, a whirlwind of terror and desperate calculation. She looked at Theron, the powerful, desperate king offering a poisoned chalice. She looked at the council, their faces masks of cold contempt, and knew she would find no mercy there. Then her mind flew back to the howling wind, the biting snow, the certainty of a lonely, frozen death for both herself and her baby. She thought of Liam, of the future he had promised, and that had been stolen from them. What future could she offer their child alone? A life on the run, hunted and feared. Here, in this cold, alien court, was a terrible, perilous kind of safety. It was a choice between two impossibilities, and her duty was not to herself, but to the life she carried. Her maternal instinct, the fierce, primal need to protect her young, made the decision for her. She lifted her chin, her voice small but unwavering in the vast, silent hall. "I accept." A collective, sharp intake of breath hissed from the council members. Theron's stoic expression did not change, but she saw the tension in his shoulders release almost imperceptibly. He had won, but as he began to turn back toward his throne, she spoke again, her voice gaining strength. On one condition. All eyes snapped back to her. He paused, turning his head slightly, an eyebrow arched in silent, imperious question. "This child is of the human world, as much as they are of yours. You will swear a magical, binding oath here before your council. Swear that you will never try to erase their human heritage. Swear that they will know of their father, of the life they came from. You are not just gaining a savior, King Theron. You are accepting a child, my child." A flicker of something akin to surprise crossed Theron's regal features, a momentary disruption in the ancient calm of his expression. He had expected her to bargain for her life, for comfort, for gold, the predictable desires of mortals. He had not anticipated a demand for something as intangible and, to him, as irrelevant as heritage. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and for the first time he saw not just the vessel of the prophecy, but the fierce, protective mother. The council stirred, a low murmur of disapproval rippling through their ranks, but Theron raised a hand, silencing them instantly. "Very well," he declared, his voice resonating with power. "A binding oath it shall be." He stepped forward, and as he spoke the ancient words, shimmering threads of silver and blue light erupted from his chest, weaving themselves into the very air around them, a tangible manifestation of a promise that could not be broken. The magic settled with the cold, heavy finality of a tombstone. There was no time for pomp or circumstance, no period of adjustment for the mortal girl who was about to become their queen. Theron, having made his oath, moved with the swift, decisive energy of a king who had just secured his most vital asset. Over the immediate, scandalized protests of Lord Valerius, who argued for tradition and proper rights, Theron decreed that the union would be sealed at once. Ilara was ushered from the throne room, not to a bridal chamber to be prepared, but directly to a smaller, more sacred space known as the Heartwood Grove. It was not a room, but a living cavern, formed by the impossibly ancient roots of a single, colossal tree. The air hummed with a primal, green magic, and the light that filtered through the leafy canopy above cast shifting patterns on the mossy floor. It was a place of immense power and deep solemnity, a place where words held the weight of mountains, and Ilara, in her simple, borrowed gown, felt like a ghost trespassing in a god's private sanctuary. The ceremony was a stark, brutal recitation of terms. There were no poetic words of love, no promises of lifelong devotion. It was the public ratification of their grim contract. Theron stood before her, his silver robes making him appear as part of the ancient tree itself, and his voice was the cold, clear sound of a winter stream. He pledged to give her the protection of his crown, the sanctuary of his kingdom, and the title of queen. He vowed to honor her child as his own heir, the future of his people. In return, Elara, her own voice barely a whisper in the vast living chamber, swore her part. She promised to bind herself to him, to accept her role, and to dedicate the life of her unborn child to the salvation of Elanthea. Each word felt like a drop of blood signed onto a devil's bargain, the sacrifice of her child's freedom for the illusion of safety. The Elven Council stood as silent, beautiful, and menacing witnesses. Their disapproval was a palpable force, a collective wave of silent contempt that washed over Elara, making her skin crawl. Lord Valerius, in particular, watched her with an expression of undisguised loathing. His eyes, the pale grey of a winter sky, did not see a queen or even a woman. They saw a contamination, a necessary but disgusting impurity brought into their sacred halls. To him, this union was not a moment of hope, but the ultimate symbol of Theron's desperation and the beginning of their realm's true defilement. Elara could feel his hatred like a physical blade pressed against her back. She understood then that this palace was not a sanctuary. It was a viper's nest, and she and her child were the defenseless prey cast into its midst, surrounded by predators who would be waiting for her to make a single mistake. The rite required an exchange, a physical symbol of the bond. Theron produced a ring, but it was unlike any she could have imagined. It was not crafted from inert metal, but forged of living, liquid silver, intertwined with a single, dark vine that still had a green leaf clinging to it. It seemed to breathe with a faint, cool light. As he took her hand, his long, cool fingers brushed against her skin, and a jolt of pure energy, sharp and startling as a lightning strike, shot up her arm. It was not painful, but it was overwhelming, a raw, untamed magic that left her breathless. Their eyes met, and in that split second she saw the king's composure shatter. A flicker of profound shock, of something wild and unguarded, flashed in the depths of his twilight eyes before his mask of cold authority slammed back into place. The ring coiled around her finger of its own accord, a cold, living manacle binding her to him. The final act of the ceremony was the sealing kiss. The air in the Heartwood Grove grew thick with a tense, charged silence. The council watched, their faces impassive, but their eyes burning with intensity. This was the moment the magical contract would become absolute, binding their souls in a way that words alone could not. Theron hesitated for a heartbeat, a pause so infinitesimal that only she, standing so close, could have perceived it. It was a moment of profound reluctance, a king steeling himself for an unpleasant but necessary duty. Then he leaned down, his magnificent face eclipsing the world. His lips were cool, like river stones, and tasted of ancient forests and the faint, metallic tang of starlight. It was meant to be a chaste, formal gesture, a mere formality. But as their lips met, a cataclysmic shockwave of sensation and emotion ripped through her. It was not passion, but something far deeper, a torrent of shared loneliness, 1,000 years of sorrow, a desperate, aching need for hope. When he pulled back, Elara was gasping, her mind reeling as if she had just been plunged into an icy sea. She looked up at him, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs, expecting to see the same cold, distant monarch. Instead, for one breathtaking, unguarded moment, his eyes were wide with the same raw shock she felt. He was staring at her as if he had never truly seen her before, not as a human vessel for his prophecy, but as a woman whose touch had somehow shaken the foundations of his ancient, ordered world. The connection had been real, and it had terrified him. He recovered in an instant, his features smoothing back into an unreadable mask of regal control. He turned to the council, his voice a pillar of strength as he declared the union sealed. But Ilara saw his hand, half hidden in the folds of his silver robe, clench into a white-knuckled fist. The pact was already spiraling out of his control. She was not returned to the simple guest quarters she had woken in. Instead, 2 guards escorted her in silence through winding, luminous corridors to the Queen's chambers, a suite of rooms that had reportedly stood empty and untouched for over 3,000 years. They were breathtakingly beautiful, carved from iridescent stone and furnished with silks and silverwood, but they were also vast, cold, and achingly lonely. The air itself felt heavy with the ghosts of memory, of a long-dead queen and a forgotten love. As the heavy carved doors clicked shut behind her, the full, crushing weight of her new reality descended. She was Queen Ilara of Elanthia, a title as hollow as the echoing silence of her opulent prison. She sank onto a chaise lounge, pressing a trembling hand to her belly, a desperate, grounding gesture. Her child was the only anchor she had left in this shimmering, alien world. Staring into a tall, silver-framed mirror, Ilara saw a stranger looking back. The haunted, half-starved woman from the forest was gone, replaced by a figure draped in an elegant, flowing gown of midnight blue that belonged to another time, another life. The scorn in Lord Valerius's eyes, the cold, calculated distance in her new husband's gaze, the suffocating responsibility of the prophecy. It was all a monstrous weight, threatening to pulverize her spirit into dust. She felt small, fragile, and utterly powerless. But then, a soft, unmistakable flutter from within her womb, a gentle kick against her hand. It was a tiny rebellion, a silent reminder of the life she was sworn to protect. A familiar spark of stubborn, fiery defiance ignited in her chest. They could give her a crown and a title, but they could not own her. She would not be their passive, grateful pawn. This was a new war, and she would learn its rules to defend the one thing that mattered. That night, the vast, silken bed remained cold. Theron did not come to her. His absence was a clear, deliberate statement, a reinforcement of the clinical nature of their agreement. This was a union of magic and politics, not of flesh and heart. He was drawing a line, establishing a boundary she was not meant to cross. Yet, as Ilara lay awake under the unfamiliar star charts painted across the vaulted ceiling, she could not erase the memory of the kiss. She could still feel the phantom pressure of his lips, the shocking, intimate torrent of emotion that had passed between them. It was a connection that defied the cold logic of their contract. She touched the living ring on her finger, its cool, smooth surface a constant reminder of her bond. She knew with a terrifying and absolute certainty that despite the empty chambers and the king's determined distance, something wild and uncontrollable had been ignited in the Heartwood Grove. The pact was sealed, but its terms were already broken. The days in Elanthia bled into a strange, timeless rhythm, a life suspended in shimmering amber. Ilara found a fragile solace in the Royal Athenaeum, a library so vast its ceiling was lost in a nebula of enchanted, floating lights. Here, surrounded by the scent of ancient parchment and dust motes dancing in ethereal beams, she could almost forget she was a queen in a gilded cage. She sought out books on human history, her fingers tracing the faded maps of a world she might never see again. It was a masochistic comfort, a way to cling to her identity. The elven attendants moved around her like graceful ghosts, their politeness a perfect, impenetrable wall. They brought her whatever she requested, but their crystalline eyes held no warmth, only a distant, unnerving curiosity, reinforcing the profound, echoing chasm of her isolation. One afternoon, As twilight painted the library's high windows in hues of violet and rose, Theron found her there. He moved with a silence that was unnerving for a being of his stature, his presence announced only by a subtle drop in temperature and the faint, clean scent of winter ozone. He didn't speak of the council or the prophecy. Instead, his gaze fell upon the worn, leather-bound volume in her lap, a collection of mortal fables. "That book was a gift," he said, his voice a low murmur that seemed to vibrate in the very shelves around them, "from a human ambassador, long before the forests were closed." The admission was a tiny, startling crack in his regal facade, a shared moment that had nothing to do with their contract. His proximity was overwhelming, a magnetic force that made the air feel thin, and she was intensely aware of him as not just a king, but a man. Her forced integration into the court's political life was a far colder affair. Theron insisted she attend the High Council meetings, a strategic move to solidify her position that felt more like being thrown to elegant, silver-haired wolves. Lord Valerius, his face a mask of aristocratic disdain, took particular pleasure in her presence. During one session, he paused the discussion on trade routes and turned his pale, assessing eyes on her. "My queen," he began, the title dripping with condescension, "perhaps you could enlighten us on the precedent set by the Sunstone Accords of the Third Age regarding territorial claims. It was a deliberate, cruel strike, a question designed to highlight her mortal ignorance and expose her as a fraud." The chamber fell silent, the other nobles watching with cold, predatory amusement, savoring her inevitable humiliation. Before the silence could crush her, Theron's voice cut through the tension, as sharp and cold as a shard of ice. "Lord Valerius, my queen's wisdom is not mired in the dusty annals of accords you yourself have conveniently misinterpreted in the past." The temperature in the room plummeted. Theron did not even look at Ilara, keeping his lethal gaze fixed on his rival. "Her value, as the prophecy you claim to revere makes clear, is in her human heartwood, a resilience you and your stagnant traditions have long forgotten. Let me be clear before this council. Any challenge to her authority is a challenge to mine. Any insult to her is a betrayal of Eilanthia's last hope." The public defense was a thunderclap, a shocking, unequivocal declaration of allegiance that left the council stunned into silence. He had not just shielded her, he had bound himself to her in front of his enemies. Shaken and breathless, Ilara followed him from the council chamber, her heart hammering against her ribs. She caught up to him in a long, sunless corridor of polished obsidian. "Thank you," she managed, the words feeling small and utterly insufficient for the stand he had just taken. He did not slow his stride, his profile as severe and unreadable as ever. "I was protecting the integrity of the prophecy," he stated, his tone clipped and dismissive. "The council must see us as a unified front. It was a political necessity." He was retreating, rebuilding the wall between them as quickly as he had torn it down. But as he spoke, his gaze met hers for a fleeting instant, and she saw it. A flash of fierce, untamed protectiveness in his twilight eyes that had nothing to do with prophecies or politics. The advance and retreat left her emotionally reeling, stranded in a confusing no-man's land between pact and passion. Later that evening, seeking refuge from the suffocating opulence of her chambers, she found her way to the Crystal Gardens. It was a place of fading beauty, where the luminous flowers that once chimed with magic now drooped in silence. Theron was already there, standing before a withered moon-petal bush, his shoulders slumped with a weight she had never seen him display in public. "They used to sing," he said softly, without turning, "before the withering. In the quiet intimacy of the dying garden, away from the court's prying eyes. He spoke of his fear, the raw, gnawing terror of being the king who would watch his world turn to dust. Emboldened by his rare vulnerability, she spoke of her own failure, of the blacksmith's daughter she couldn't save. In that shared moment of sorrow and responsibility, The king and the outcast found a fragile, common ground, two weary souls burdened by fates they could not control. Their tentative truce was tested days later during a small, formal reception. An ambitious young elven lord named Lyran, perhaps seeing an opportunity to gain favor, approached Ilara with a disarming smile. He spoke of mortal poetry and asked about her homeland, his compliments a startling warmth in the usual sea of icy indifference. Across the hall, Theron observed their conversation, his posture unchanged, his expression a placid mask. Yet, Ilara felt the shift instantly. A subtle chill bled into the air, the magical lights overhead seeming to dim. Theron moved across the room with the silent, inexorable grace of a predator. He said nothing, simply came to stand beside her, his presence a towering wall of possessive energy. Lyran's charming smile froze, and he offered a hasty bow before practically fleeing. Theron's silent, powerful claim was terrifying, and to her shame, it sent a forbidden thrill racing through her veins. Alone that night, the silken sheets of her vast bed felt colder than ever. She replayed the events of the past weeks in her mind, the stunning defense in the council, the shared sorrow in the garden, the raw, unspoken jealousy he had displayed over Lyran. These were not the calculated actions of a monarch fulfilling the bare minimum of a contract. This was something deeper, messier, more human. She twisted the living ring on her finger, its faint, cool pulse, a constant connection to his magic, to him. A dangerous, terrifying question bloomed in the silence of her heart. Are we really just pretending? The line they had drawn between them, the safe boundary of their political pact, was dissolving into a haze of undeniable emotion. She was beginning to fear that the greatest danger in this alien world wasn't the hostile court, but the king himself, and the feelings he was starting to evoke in her. Theron's declaration in the council did not silence his dissenters. It galvanized them. Lord Valerius and his faction now saw Ilara not just as an impurity, but as a dangerous influence corrupting their king's judgment. The court's hostility intensified, shifting from subtle slights to a campaign of open psychological warfare. Malicious whispers followed her down the corridors, twisting the story of her exile into a dark tale of black magic and seduction. Noble ladies would turn their backs in a rustle of silk as she approached, their conversations ceasing abruptly. A servant would, accidentally, spill wine on her gown just before a formal dinner. Each incident was a small, sharp cut, designed to remind her of her otherness, to isolate her completely and prove to everyone, including Theron, that a human could never and should never be their queen. Refusing to be broken, Ilara discovered her own battlefield. She began spending her days in the royal greenhouses, a series of vast, crystalline domes where elven botanists fought a losing war against the withering. The elves worked with high magic, chanting to coax life from the blighted soil, but they overlooked the fundamentals. Drawing on the earthy knowledge her grandmother had taught her, Ilara began to work with her hands. She diagnosed nutrient deficiencies, organized composting systems, and introduced the simple, mortal concept of crop rotation. The elven healers watched her, their ancient faces a mixture of skepticism and desperation. But as a small patch of silverleaf herbs began to show a hint of new, healthy growth under her care, a few of the younger elves began to watch her with a flicker of something new, grudging respect. It was in the humid, earthy air of the greenhouses that their fragile truce was shattered by an undeniable spark. Theron came to see her work, drawn by the whispers of her small success. He found her kneeling in the dirt, her brow beaded with sweat, and a smudge of dark soil streaked across her cheek. She looked more real, more alive than he had ever seen her. He moved toward her, an unreadable expression on his face, and reached out, his long, elegant fingers intending to wipe the smudge from her skin. The moment his thumb grazed her cheek, a jolt of pure, unadulterated energy, far more potent than the shock at their ceremony, arced between them. They both froze, trapped in the crackling, supercharged silence, their breaths catching in their throats. The raw, physical pull was a living thing, a magnetic force that defied logic and duty. He snatched his hand back as if he'd been burned, his composure utterly fractured. Their charged moment was violently interrupted by the arrival of a guard, followed closely by Lord Valerius, whose face was a mask of grim, triumphant formality. He paid Ilara no mind, his eyes fixed solely on his king. "My Lord Theron," he announced, his voice echoing through the greenhouse, a stark intrusion of politics into their private space. "The Council has consulted the celestial texts. The prophecy is clear. To consecrate the air and bind their magic to the heart of Ilanthia, the ancient rite of celestial bonding must be performed." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "It is an intricate and demanding ceremony, one that must be completed before the turning of the next full moon, or the prophecy will fail." It was a new demand, a conveniently discovered piece of law, and Ilara knew with chilling certainty it was a trap. A public trial designed to expose her as an unworthy mortal and shatter their burgeoning connection forever. The fragile, supercharged intimacy of the greenhouse shattered into a million pieces the moment Valerius spoke. Theron's face, which had for a breathtaking instant been open with shock, and something softer, something unguarded, instantly hardened back into the impenetrable mask of the king. He turned from Ilara without another word, his entire posture radiating a cold, dismissive authority that was more wounding than any verbal blow. The warmth that had arced between them was extinguished, replaced by a frigid, suffocating silence that followed them all the way back to the main palace. He walked several paces ahead of her, a deliberate, calculated distance that re-established their roles. He was the monarch, and she was the asset. Ilara's heart, which had just begun to thaw, froze solid once more. She understood with chilling clarity that this rite of celestial bonding was not a formality. It was a new, elegant weapon aimed directly at her, and the man walking before her was not her ally, but her king, who would use her as he saw fit. Later, in the solitude of his vast, star-charted study, Theron felt the walls of his own making close in around him. He unrolled the ancient scrolls Valerius had cited, his long fingers tracing the faded, spidery script that confirmed his worst fears. The rite of celestial bonding was real, and it was far more than a simple ceremony. It was a brutal magical crucible, a trial by ordeal designed in a crueler, more xenophobic age to test the purity and magical resilience of any non-elven consort. The text spoke of channeling raw celestial energy through the mortal's body, a process that would be excruciatingly painful and, if the subject was deemed unworthy by the ancient magic, potentially lethal to both mother and child. His duty demanded he subject her to this. His soul, however, recoiled in horror. To tell her the truth would risk her refusal and the damnation of his people. To conceal it was a monstrous betrayal of the fierce, courageous woman who was beginning to feel less like a prophecy and more like the only real thing in his fading world. She found him on his balcony that night, a solitary silhouette against the dying starlight of his kingdom. Ilara did not wait for an invitation to speak. "What is this rite?" she demanded, her voice steady and sharp, stripped of all its earlier softness. She was not a supplicant. She was a queen, and her fury was a palpable force. Another test, another public spectacle designed to prove my unworthiness. The accusation hung between them, heavy and sharp as a headsman's axe. Theron turned slowly, his face a study in controlled agony. He saw not the vessel of his hope, but a woman he was actively betraying, and the self-loathing was a poison in his throat. He wanted to reach for her, to explain the impossible weight of his crown, but the chasm between them was too wide, filled with the debris of his necessary deceptions and her justified mistrust. The silence stretched, a testament to how profoundly broken their fragile bond had become. The ensuing argument was a storm of raw, conflicting duties. He spoke of Eilanthia's survival, of the thousands of lives that rested on this single, desperate gamble, his voice strained with the weight of millennia. "This is about more than us, Elara," he insisted, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "It is about the future of a whole people." Her response was a blaze of maternal fire. "There is nothing more important than the future of this child," she cried, her hand protectively covering her womb. "You swore an oath to me, to us." The accusation struck him with the force of a physical blow. His control finally fractured, his regal facade crumbling to reveal the tormented man beneath. "Everything I have done since I pulled you from that snow has been to protect you," he confessed, his voice a raw, desperate whisper. "Do you truly believe I would lead you into a danger I did not think we could overcome? That I would risk you?" The question was a near confession, an admission of a personal stake that went far beyond any prophecy. Her righteous anger wavered, thrown off balance by the raw, undeniable pain in his eyes. For the first time, she saw the full extent of the trap he was in, a king chained to a dying world, forced to make monstrous choices, the fight drained out of her, replaced by a deep, hollow ache of shared despair. "Then help me," she whispered, her voice breaking, a plea that was more intimate than any touch had been. "Don't hide this from me. Trust me." Theron took a half-step toward her, the space between them now humming with a different kind of tension, not of anger, but of agonizing, impossible longing. He raised a hand, his fingers trembling almost imperceptibly as he fought the urge to cup her face, to feel her warmth. He let it fall, a gesture of profound defeat. "I cannot," he breathed, the words tearing from his soul. "The truth would give you a choice, and I am selfish enough, desperate enough, not to let you make it. All I can do is ask you to trust me, even now." The following day dawned under a sky the color of old pewter, the mood in the palace just as somber. A formal summons was issued, its heavy parchment and wax seal a harbinger of doom. The entire elven court was to assemble in the great throne room at dusk. No reason was given, but the air crackled with a dreadful, electric anticipation, as Elara was led from her chambers, clad in a gown of deep violet that felt as heavy as a burial shroud. She saw Theron standing at the end of the long obsidian corridor. He was already in his full regalia, the silver crown a weight of sorrows on his brow. Their eyes met across the vast, empty space, a silent, desperate exchange filled with everything they had failed to say. Then, the immense doors before them swung open, revealing the assembled court, a sea of beautiful, hostile faces. All turned toward them, waiting for the judgment that would determine the fate of a queen, a king, and a kingdom on the brink of twilight. The vast throne room was a theater of judgment, the air thick with the scent of ancient stone and palpable animosity. Every member of the elven court was present, their beautiful, impassive faces turned toward Elara like a gallery of exquisite, predatory birds. Lord Valerius stood before the weirwood throne, his silver robe shimmering, his voice a cold, clear bell of triumph. "The hour is upon us," he declared, his gaze flicking to the celestial map projected onto the domed ceiling. "The celestial alignment is perfect. It is time for the rite of celestial bonding to commence, to prove the mortal vessel worthy and bind the air's magic to the heart of our realm." He gestured to a raised dais, a stark, empty platform where Elara was meant to endure her trial. His words were a public condemnation, framing her as a gamble, a fragile human container who would likely shatter and fail, taking all their hopes with her. The collective, silent pressure of the court was a physical force, a wave of doubt and disdain that threatened to drown her before the rite even began. Theron did not move toward the dais. He did not acknowledge the celestial map or the expectant, hostile silence of his court. Instead, in a move that defied 1,000 years of tradition, he turned his back on his throne and walked directly to Elara. Each step was a deliberate, resounding rejection of Valerius, of the council, of the cruel and archaic laws they sought to weaponize against her. He stopped before her, so close she could feel the faint, cool aura of his power, and looked down into her eyes. In that moment, the weight of his crown, the sorrow of his kingdom, all of it vanished, leaving only the raw, unguarded emotion of a man on the precipice of losing everything that truly mattered. His voice, when he spoke, was not a king's decree, but a hushed, reverent confession meant only for her, yet it carried to every corner of the silent hall. "They speak of your human heartwood, as if it is a weakness," he murmured, his gaze tracing the lines of her face. "They are blind. I have seen your strength, your courage in the face of a world that cast you out. I have seen the ferocity of your love for our child. That is the magic Eilanthia has forgotten." He reached out and took her hand, his fingers lacing through hers. A firm, grounding anchor in the sea of hostility, he turned facing his stunned court, but his eyes never left Elara's. The prophecy was never a contract for a magical cure, he declared, his voice ringing with a conviction that shook the very foundations of the hall. It was a warning that our pride, our isolation, our fear of the new would be our end. It spoke of a union not of convenience, but of true connection, a bond powerful enough to bridge two worlds and remind our fading souls what it means to hope. He squeezed her hand, turning his entire being back to her, the rest of the world falling away. "I was a fool, blinded by duty. I did not bring you here to be a savior, Elara. I brought you here because, from the moment I touched you in the snow, my soul knew it had found its counterpart. My reign, my life, this kingdom, they are meaningless without you. I love you." The words, a torrent of pure, unshielded truth, shattered the oppressive silence, a declaration of war against tradition and a surrender to his heart. A gasp rippled through the court, but the very magic of the room seemed to hold its breath, responding not to the celestial alignment, but to the sheer, unadulterated power of his confession. As his words settled over her, a soft, golden light began to emanate from Elara's heart, a warm, gentle pulse that had nothing to do with the cold starlight of the rite. It was the magic of life, of love given and returned, a power far more ancient and potent than any elven ritual. The strength that surged through her was immense, a quiet certainty that washed away all fear. She was not a vessel to be tested. She was the key. Looking at the king who had just laid his soul bare for her, she saw not a captor, but her home. "And I love you," she replied, her voice unwavering and clear. As the words left her lips, the golden light exploded outward, a gentle, silent shockwave of pure, life-giving energy that swept through the entire throne room, a testament to a power born of their union. The wave of warm, golden magic washed over the assembled elves, and for the first time in centuries, they felt the creeping chill of the withering recede, replaced by a vibrant, forgotten vitality. A collective sigh of awe and disbelief swept the room. Behind the throne, the ancient, gnarled branches of the weirwood tree erupted in a profusion of new, shimmering silver leaves, its life force restored in an instant. Lord Valerius stared, his face a mask of utter, shattering defeat, as the very soul of Eilanthia embraced the human queen he had tried so desperately to destroy. The prophecy was fulfilled, not by pain and sacrifice, but by love and acceptance. Theron, his twilight eyes shining with tears of profound relief and boundless adoration, framed her face with his hands and kissed her. It was a kiss of equals, a deep and final sealing of their souls that anchored the new magic in place. Witnessing the undeniable miracle, the entire elven court, as one, sank to their knees in reverence for their true king and queen. Months later, the air in Eilanthia no longer carried the scent of dust and decay, but of damp earth. night-blooming moon petal, and new beginnings. The streams sang their ancient songs once more, and the silver leaves of the forest shimmered with a light so bright it seemed to challenge the stars themselves. Ilara stood on the high balcony of their chambers, the cool night air a gentle caress on her skin. In her arms, a small, sleeping bundle, a baby with her human resilience and his father's starlit eyes, breathed the peaceful air of a world reborn. Theron came to stand behind her, wrapping his arms around them both, his chin resting on her shoulder as they looked out at the healed kingdom. They had been two souls forged in the brutal cold of loneliness and loss. But together, they had found more than a home. They had become one. Their journey from a winter's end to a new dawn was complete. If their story warmed your heart against the cold, please show your love by liking this video, commenting with your favorite moment, and subscribing for more tales that defy the darkness.